Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Deadly Desires podcast with me, your host, Brandon Brooker. If you are new here, we talk about a new true crime case every single week, so if that sounds interesting to you, make sure to subscribe here on YouTube, and the link to listen on Spotify is always in the description. Before we get started, I want to give some content warnings. If you like to eat watching videos like this, then I would suggest you do not with this one. But the content warnings are as follows: murder, cannibalism, mutilation, suicide, PTSD, and schizophrenia. If these themes are too much for you, I understand. You can click out now and I'll see you next week. With that being said, let's get on to the case. Tim Mclean was born on October 3rd, 1985 in Manitoba in Canada, and he was 22 years old at the time of this case. It has been said that Tim was a very athletic person. He loved sports, he loved adventures and going out travelling to different places. He was quite a spontaneous person. Tim was a very confident and outgoing person. He was very social, he loved to make new friends. He would just go into a room and pretty much anyone would want to be friends with Tim Mclean. In the summer of 2007, Tim's friend Tiffany gave him a phone call asking him what his plans were for the summer. What he was doing, was he going travelling, was he getting a job? What is he doing this summer? And Tim just said that he didn't really have any plans. So Tiffany told him to pack his bags and they might be gone for more than a week or even longer, and they were just going to get out of town. They didn't have a plan, it was all very spontaneous. So the two of them, Tim and Tiffany, set off on their journey with no plan, and at some point on their journey, they came across a carnival which was travelling all over Canada. So Tim and Tiffany thought this would be perfect for them. They would both get jobs with this carnival, and they found a lot of perks that came along with this job. They would be able to travel all over Canada for the summer. They would get to meet a whole lot of new people. And to them, it sounded like a really fun time. So they both got jobs at this travelling carnival, and Tim thrived in this environment. As I said before, Tim was a very social person, so being able to socialise with people all day and all night was perfect for him. They would have these massive parties every single night where they would get drunk, and it was every night. Sounds like an extremely fun summer to me. And Tim and Tiffany loved this carnival lifestyle so much that instead of just staying for the summer, they ended up staying for a full year, travelling all over Canada. In the summer of 2008, Tim was now 22 years old and had decided that it was probably now time to leave the carnival and start thinking about settling down. His plan was to move to British Columbia in Canada. He wanted a house, a stable job, and to begin starting a family in the next couple of years. He had decided that travelling wasn't for him anymore. In the end of July of 2008, the carnival was getting ready to move on again. It moved every couple of months. And this time it was moving from Edmonton to Regina. And Tim decided that this was the perfect time for him to leave the carnival and begin his life. So instead of following the carnival to Regina, he decided that he was going to go back home to Winnipeg. And the distance between where he was in Edmonton and his parents' house in Winnipeg was a huge distance. It was either a 24-hour bus ride or a 2-hour flight. Tim didn't have enough money to be able to afford this plane ticket, and neither did anyone at the carnival because they were pretty much spending all their money as they were travelling. However, regardless of this, all of his carnival friends said they would all pitch in to be able to try and afford this plane ticket. But in a way, Tim was being a bit stubborn. He didn't mind getting the 24-hour bus. He'd been on long-haul journeys before, and he really didn't want any of his friends spending all their money on him just to get a plane ticket. 12:01 a.m. on July 30th, 2008, Tim Mclean boarded the 1170 Greyhound bus from Edmonton. Tim walked to the back of the bus and took one of the seats at the back of the bus, which was 2 rows in front of the toilets. And it wasn't uncommon for Tim to sit near the back. I feel like that's a lot of people's preferred seat I know it definitely is my preferred area to sit. Now, Tim Mclean has now begun his 24-hour journey back to his parents' house in Winnipeg. However, there will be multiple stops on the way, and one of these last stops is where the story takes a dark turn. At 6:55 p.m. the next day, so almost 17 hours into his journey home, so he really wasn't that far from his home. And this is when the bus stopped in Erickson in Manitoba. A few new passengers got on the bus, however it was nowhere near full enough that people would need to start finding a seat next to a stranger. At this point, Tim was asleep at the back of the bus, and as new people got onto the bus, they would fill it up from the front, so Tim was left undisturbed. A few hours later, the bus had stopped again for a quick break, so people could get some food, stretch their legs, they could have a cigarette. Tim got off the bus and did his thing, but as everybody reboarded the bus, one of those passengers that had gotten on at Erickson decided that he wanted to move seats. Initially, this man had gotten on and sat near the front of the bus, but when reboarding at this next stop, he grabbed his belongings from his old seat and made his way to the back of the bus, and it said that he was analysing every single person as he made his way down the aisle. This man was a middle-aged Chinese man with a shaved head. He was quite tall, and he was wearing sunglasses the entire time. This man went right to the back of the bus where Tim Mclean was sat, and Tim was the only person on this bus that actually acknowledged this man. He began making small talk, just asking how he was. This bus was still half empty, so he could have sat anywhere by himself, had some extra room, but instead he decided to go and sit right next to 22-year-old Tim Mclean. Tim didn't really think anything of it and fell back asleep with his head against the window, but according to other passengers, this man began acting extremely strangely. He had a toilet roll which he never put down the entire journey. He also had a 2-litre bottle of iced tea which he kept drinking from, but he of course needed both hands to be able to open it. So instead of putting down the toilet roll, he would just put it under his chin, and then when he was finished opening it, he would take it out from his chin. He never once put down this toilet roll. So, the layout of the bus is you have the aisle and then two rows of seats on each side. Pretty standard. So, the people on the row of seats across from the aisle from Tim Mclean and this random man, so say they're here, the people here, they began to notice some extremely odd and concerning behaviour. This man was rocking back and forth in his seat. He was chanting something under his breath, but these people had no idea what he was saying because it wasn't in English. At this point, it was about 8 p.m. It was dark outside and the bus didn't have its internal lights on so that the passengers could sleep. The only light that was being emitted was from small TV screens above the passengers' heads so that they'd be able to watch the movie that was being played. And despite it being almost pitch black, this man sat next to Tim Mclean never took his sunglasses off once. About 8:20 p.m, the people across the aisle from Tim and this man saw this strange man get out a knife. It was a proper hunting knife, so it was extremely sharp. He took off the cover from this knife, turned to his right and began stabbing Tim Mclean. A man across the aisle who saw this happen shot up and screamed to the bus driver, "Stop the bus, someone's being stabbed." Immediately, anyone on this bus went into pure panic. People were screaming, crying, throwing up, running to the front of the bus to try and escape. However, this bus was speeding down the highway, so there was nowhere to go. At this point, Tim had woken up and he had realised he was being stabbed by the man sat next to him, and he was screaming bloody murder. And people on that bus have said that those screams were the most haunting thing that they have ever heard. He had tried to escape his attacker, but the only way he could escape was to go over the attacker because there were seats both in front and behind of him. So he did just that. He climbed over his attacker but fell into the aisle where his attacker continued to frenzied stab him. By the time the bus had pulled over, Tim must have been stabbed a good 60 times, and this man showed no signs of stopping. But miraculously, Tim was still alive. He was still screaming. The man who had raised the alarm of Tim's stabbing had gone back to rescue his girlfriend, and that's when he noticed 3 people sat in the back rows, the ones behind Tim Mclean, and obviously they were trapped by the attack going on in the aisle. These 3 people were an elderly woman, her son, and his wife. So this man and his girlfriend began helping these 3 people climb over these rows of seats to safety. At this point, everyone but Tim Mclean and his attacker had run off the bus to safety, and this bus driver had locked the doors and immobilised the bus to stop him attacking anybody else or trying to be able to drive away. And all these passengers were just stood on the side of the highway in sheer terror. People were still crying, throwing up, people were having fits. It was a very traumatic experience for everyone on that bus. At this time, a truck driver named Chris Alguire was driving down the highway when he noticed this bus pulled over and saw all these people in pure panic. So as he passed, he rolled down his window to see what was going on. And someone shouted to him, "Come help, someone is being stabbed to death on this bus." So Chris pulled over to the side of the road, went into the back of his truck and got out a heavy metal bar and made his way onto the bus, joined by the bus driver and another male passenger. So they made their way onto the bus, stood at the front and just stood there watching this attacker stabbing Tim Mclean. At this point they knew there was no saving Tim. So even if they did confront this attacker, they knew that there was no way Tim would survive. He must have been stabbed way over 100 times at this point. As these 3 men are stood at the front of the bus, Tim's attacker stops stabbing Tim, looks up at the men with no emotion in his face, and Chris describes his expression as empty. These 3 men are just stood there frozen in fear, trauma and shock as he watched a man stabbing this man. And these men had weapons, but this attacker didn't seem the slightest bit fazed by these men. Just got up, moved to the other side of Tim's body and began decapitating him. As I said, these 3 men were frozen. They didn't leave the bus, they just stood there. Once this man had finished beheading Tim's body, he began walking down the aisle towards these men, with the knife in one hand and Tim's severed head in the other. At this point, the men kind of snapped out of their frozen state. They realised that there was no point trying to fight the man. There was no one else left on the bus for him to hurt, and there were lots of people outside, including children, which needed protecting. So the 3 men ran off the bus and tried barricading the door as best as they could. Of course, the police have been called at this point, but because it was in the middle of the highway, it was taking them quite a while to get there. As the men were barricading the door, the attacker walked over to the door. He didn't try to escape or attack them. He just raised the knife and Tim's head and displayed it to everybody stood outside, and walked back down the aisle, back over Tim's body. He began walking up and down the bus, just displaying Tim's severed head to the passengers and to passing cars. At this point, some police officers had arrived on scene. However, they weren't doing anything to stop this man. They were waiting for a full-on SWAT team and a sense of direction from higher authorities. As police were waiting, the attacker kept walking over to Tim's body, cutting off different pieces and eating them, and this went on for 4 hours. 4 hours of the police and SWAT team waiting. They did have a plan, however, it wasn't to stop this man. They came to the conclusion that this man was probably in a psychotic rage, some sort of mental health episode, and they were hoping that he would eventually come out of this rage, and that is when they would move in and do something. The longer this man had on the bus, the longer he had to calm down and hopefully snap out of this episode, and was more likely to go with the police willingly rather than having to take him forcefully or even shooting him. They didn't know what he would try and do if they tried to arrest him while he was still in this psychotic rage. He might even try and kill somebody else. At one point, the killer did sit in the driver's seat and tried to drive away. However, this was unsuccessful due to the bus driver turning on the immobilizing feature, which, thank God, because this case could have gotten a lot worse had he been able to drive away. He could have gotten into an accident, he could have intentionally crashed trying to kill more people. After a few hours, all the passengers had been transported to different police stations, alongside a few of the police officers who had initially been at the scene because they were all equally as traumatised from what they had seen. Finally, at 1:30 a.m, 5 hours after the initial attack on Tim Mclean began, the killer had tried to smash a back window and try to escape. He shot him twice with a taser, tackled him to the ground and arrested him before transporting him to the police station. Forensic teams were sent to the scene, and when looking around they found different pieces of Tim Mclean's body scattered all over the bus. The next morning, this story was breaking news worldwide. It was on every single news channel. It was such a horrific event to happen. No one kind of expects this sort of thing to happen. At this point, Tim Mclean's body was left unidentified. I mean, it was so disfigured and mutilated. I'm sure it was extremely difficult to be able to identify this body. So his family was unaware of his murder. News outlets weren't able to say anything. They just described this man as a young white male because he had no identification on him and they didn't even know his age. That morning, Tim's mother Carol got up for work like any other day. She worked as a chef at a senior citizen's home, and as she was getting ready, she was watching the news and heard this story about her son's brutal murder, not knowing that it was her own son. So Carol worked her day as usual, but says at around midday, she began getting a really bad gut feeling, but she just dismissed it, thinking it was nothing. All day they had been watching the news, and as I said before, she was a chef, so she made food for all of the residents, and before they all ate this meal, they said grace and did a prayer for the family of this unknown murder victim, not knowing that the victim's mother was right in the room with them. After this prayer, Carol turned to a resident and mentioned that her son was making that journey and how it could easily have been her son. His dad, who was also called Tim Mclean, and his stepmother were scheduled to have dinner later that night. So Tim Sr. had gone out to pick up his son's favourite meal, which was fried chicken. And when he returned home, he found all of Tim's friends standing on his doorstep. And Tim wasn't there, and all of his friends had very serious expressions on their face. So they asked Tim Sr. if they had heard what had happened, and he said no. He was a bit confused, so he said, "What happened to what?" And when his friend said Tim, his heart dropped. So his friends took his father inside the house, sat him down in front of his computer, and pulled up the first news article on Tim's case. At this point, the police believed they had identified the body on the Greyhound bus to be that of Tim Mclean. His ID was found on the bus, but they had to check that it wasn't anybody else's beforehand. 7:30 p.m. that night, Tim Sr. phoned up Tim's mother Carol and broke the news that the person murdered on that Greyhound bus was their son, 22-year-old Tim Mclean. Now, back at the police station, Tim Mclean's killer had been identified. 41-year-old Chinese immigrant Vincent Lee. The police took his clothes to be used as evidence. Inside his pockets, they found Tim's ear, nose, and tongue. To this day, both his eyes and a bit of his heart have never been found, so it's highly believed that these have been eaten by Vince Lee alongside different parts of his flesh from around his body. During his police questioning, he took the police through the story of the murder of Tim Mclean from start to finish, beginning 24 hours before he'd even met Tim. Vince Lee had taken the exact same bus route that Tim Mclean had taken, but a whole 24 hours earlier. Vince Lee also lived in Winnipeg, which was also the final stop of the bus journey, the same as Tim would be doing 24 hours later. However, Vince Lee decided to get off the bus 8 hours early in Erickson. He had paid for the ticket all the way to Winnipeg, which means he had the intention to go the full way, but decided to get off early at the last minute. Vince Lee was actually suffering from undiagnosed schizophrenia. He would hear voices in his head that he thought was God that would tell him to do different things, such as getting off the bus early in Erickson. This voice in his head had told him that someone was going to try and kill him and that he should buy himself a knife to defend himself, and he did exactly that. The voice told him to get off the bus in Erickson, so he did, and he just sat on a bench waiting for the voice to tell him what to do next. As he was sat waiting for these orders from the voice, he was acting very strangely. A truck was driving past him slower than usual, and he got out his knife, ready to kill these people in the truck, but by the time he had gotten out his knife, this truck was too far away from him. Vincent Lee spent the whole night sat on this bench just waiting for an order. Witnesses say they saw him sat straight up on this bench with his eyes wide open at 3 a.m. Next morning, Vincent got his laptop out of his bag, stuck a sign to it saying, "For sale for $600. He never gave any reason for doing this. He didn't say that the voice had told him to do it. It appeared he just did it very randomly. 16-year-old boy who worked across the street was walking past Vincent on his bench, and he was asked by Vince if he wanted to buy this laptop from him. The boy looked at this sign and was like, no, sorry, I don't have $600. And Vincent just looked at him and then asked if he wanted it for $60. And of course, this boy jumped at the opportunity. It was a pretty good quality laptop, and so he bought it off Vincent. And this was the only interaction that Vince had with anyone the whole 24 hours he was in Erickson. And this voice hadn't given him any more orders this whole time. So we decided, instead of wasting time just waiting for an order, he would get on to the next bus, which happened to have Tim Mclean on it. And now we know the story from here. He initially sat at the front of the bus and then later moved to the back of the bus to sit next to Tim Mclean, which again, he never gave a reason to as why he sat next to Tim specifically. And at 8:20 p.m, Vincent said he heard the voice again for the first time in 24 hours. And it was God talking to him that he had to kill Tim Mclean, and so he just did what he was told. He also said that the voice had told him he had to mutilate and dismember Tim's body, otherwise Tim would come back to life and kill him. And he says that's why he ate parts of the body. It wouldn't be able to come back to life if he ate them, right? It was pretty clear to police that there was some degree of mental illness going on with Vince Lee. No mentally sound person kills, decapitates and cannibalizes a stranger. So he was assessed by psychiatrists and was diagnosed with schizophrenia at the age of 41, but it was thought that he may have been struggling with it since around the age of 20. He would tell mental health professionals that he was evil and that God was evil too, and that is why God liked him and wanted him to carry out his murders on earth on his behalf. He said the voice told him to kill Tim, but he didn't know why Tim specifically. He just did what he was told to do. Vincent Lee was hoping for and expecting to be given the death penalty for his crimes. However, Canada does not impose the death penalty. He repeatedly told psychiatrists that God wanted him to die, and if he wasn't going to be given the death penalty, then he would do it to himself. In court, Vince Lee was found not criminally responsible for the murder due to the mental illness and being so far gone from reality. In his head, it was a kill or be killed situation for him. He was acting on what this voice, God, was telling him to do. In that moment, he didn't know right from wrong. Vincent Lee was sent to a psychiatric hospital to receive treatment instead of being sent to a prison, where he wouldn't receive the care he needs. The earliest he could have been released was in 2012, only 4 years after the murder. However, he wasn't released then, as his mental state hadn't improved enough for him to be let out. After the murder, Greyhound buses created a campaign, and their slogan was, "There's a reason you've never heard of bus rage," which clearly relates to this case and is incredibly disrespectful towards Tim and his family. And within a year of the murder of Tim Mclean, this next bit is just disgusting. PETA, the charity, the animal rights charity with the rabbit, that organisation, attempted to run a campaign likening the murder of Tim Mclean to the consumption of animal products. Fortunately, all outlets denied the publishing of this campaign, but even the attempt is extremely disrespectful and sickening. In 2011, 2 female passengers on the bus decided to file a lawsuit against Greyhound, the police and the Canadian government on the grounds of psychological damage because of everything they had seen that night. Both women were filing for settlements of $3 million each. However, mysteriously in 2015, both women dropped their lawsuits at the exact same time. In 2012, only 4 years after the murder, Vincent Lee was allowed unsupervised day visits outside of the psychiatric hospital, which is terrifying. July of 2014, one of the police officers who had initially shown up to the crime scene unfortunately took his own life after struggling from severe PTSD from what he had seen that night, which is incredibly sad. In February of 2016, only 7 years after the murder of Tim Mclean, 7 years after stabbing, decapitating and cannibalising a stranger, Vincent Lee was let free out of the psychiatric hospital that he was in. He still lives in Canada. I'm unsure whereabouts in Canada. Canada's a big place. But he now has a new name. He goes by Will Baker. And due to him being found criminally irresponsible, he has no criminal record. Which I get to some extent. He was found not criminally responsible. However, he still did it, and I think that it should be on some sort of record. But at least his new name is public information. His name is Will Baker, and here's his picture on screen. So, I'm sorry to any of you who live in Canada. That is all I have for this case. However, there is something I want to say before closing off this video. Of course, we're talking about a horrible, brutal case today. However, there is a stigma around people who have schizophrenia and mental health conditions altogether, but specifically schizophrenia. Not all people who have it are killers. Schizophrenia has a bad image because of cases like this one. But think of all the people who don't have this condition that commit these terrible murders. I just wanted to talk about this because I think that people with schizophrenia and mental health conditions in general get a bad rap. Not all schizophrenia sufferers hear voices, like Vincent did, but other people's symptoms manifest in other ways. And I just think it's unfair to judge a whole group of people based on cases such as this one. With that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and comment. This really helps me out. If you want to subscribe, there'll be a circle on screen. I would really appreciate it if you did. And if you want to watch another video from me, there will be another one on screen too. Okay, bye.